I describe it as the hobby that wouldn't die. And it was something that was just not possible to do nights and weekends. I had tried doing it, but I had a pretty senior job and there's not a lot of free time. And consulting in general is intense hours. I just didn't have the time to do it. And as an indie solo animator, I'm literally trying to do 20 to 30 different people's jobs. Like in a conventional studio, you'd have a bunch of different people doing each of these jobs. That's why it takes 400 to 600 people to make a studio animated feature. And doing it all by yourself, I'm not good at any of them, but I'm doing kind of crap versions of each of them and putting them all together. It's not the kind of thing you can do.
Did you know the average person will work 90,000 hours in their lifetime? What if you could use those hours to find fulfillment and become a disruptor for good? Welcome to the Work That's Worth It podcast. I'm Georgie Enthoven, and I'm here to demonstrate that an ambitious, meaningful, and rewarding career is not just a dream, it's achievable. Each episode will dive into conversations with global change makers who've cracked the code on combining income and impact. If you've ever felt like you were torn between a paycheck and your purpose, or maybe you simply yearn for more purpose, you're going to be exposed to the ambitious humans who have done it themselves. Ready to make your work worth it? Let's get started. Today, I have Antony Koithra on the show, a consultant turned animator. But before we dive in, a little backstory. Sometimes I find the not yet figured it all out part of the story so relatable and interesting. Antony's experience is not overtly focused on impact per se, but I wanted him on the show for a particular reason. If you've been listening in, you may remember that I recently did my first solo episode, number 27, and shared with you a question I got from students at Stanford, but it boiled down to judging others' career choices. The students used language such as sellout for their peers taking jobs in consulting firms, banks, and big tech. But maybe because I have many years under my belt already, or maybe because I take the long view, a career journey is not a purity test, and many nuanced factors are at play at any given time. Through many conversations that I've had, I've found that the sellout jobs have often given an important launching pad for the impact later on. So today, I want you to listen to Antony's story to understand more about the choices he made along the way, involving a decade at Boston Consulting Group, one of the top 3 strategy consulting firms in the world, working his way up to MD and partner. And through consulting, he built up a financial cushion that now gives him the freedom at this more seasoned stage of his career to jump in 100% to nurture what he calls the hobby that wouldn't die. Antony is now a full-stack indie animated filmmaker who creates sci-fi and fantasy stories about robots, aliens, and vampires, but from an immigrant perspective, confronting accepted narratives about how we live in a multicultural society. He made what he calls responsible career choices, and there's no judgment here. Sometimes you need the money, the skills, or the financial runway that eventually gives you the freedom to take bigger risks. What's particularly interesting is how Antony jumped off the lucrative consulting ladder to pay attention to his career desires, and that's hard to do. So if you've ever wondered what it's really like inside one of those prestigious consulting firms, or you're trying to balance financial responsibility with creative calling, this conversation will show you that sometimes the scenic route through your 90,000 career hours is exactly the right path, as long as you stay awake to where the magic wants to emerge. Antony, lovely to have you on the Work That's Worth It podcast.
So nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, we have so many fun things to talk about. It's wonderful to have somebody creative on the podcast. And I know that we'll get to animated film, but I would love to jump into how you got started in your career.
Sure, yeah. It's kind of a weird story considering I ended up making animated films, but I grew up in India, and growing up in India, you have various responsible career paths and education routes that you take to get there. And so, there's doctors and engineers and lawyers and so on. And I was always pretty good at math, so I did engineering, and I studied engineering in Singapore at National University there. And then I always had this thing of I always loved making films and telling stories and things like that. I just never really saw that as a viable career path or a predictable career path that would make me a living wage, right? Like the risk.
It wasn't on the menu.
Yeah, like the risk levels just seems too high. And I am a pretty risk averse person. And so I did engineering and then ended up going and working at a bank, which, you know how you make career decisions out of college and you have absolutely, when you think back on them 20 years later, you're like, that was a really dumb reason to make that career decision and spend the rest.
So what was the reason? What happened?
I'll tell you, Deutsche Bank came recruiting on campus and they had a 3-month training program in London. I was like, that sounds like a lot of fun. I want to do that. And so I signed on because there was, I'd get to spend 3 months in London. And don't get me wrong, that was a lot of fun. It's just a silly reason to choose a career path that I ended up doing for like 4 years. I worked in Singapore for a few years and then moved to Japan because our team there was understaffed. And all wonderful experiences. I loved being in Japan. But I continuously had this thing of like, I love telling stories. I love movies. I love film. And so I was like, what is the way in which I can do that kind of thing, but still have a responsible job, right? Like where I'm making money.
So early on, you already knew that something was missing?
Yeah, kind of. And I used to fill it the way I think a lot of people fill it, which is like through hobbies, right? So all through college and all through my time in Singapore and Japan, I was making little films and like a couple of animations and things like that, or put them in festivals. I had like a short film that won a National Geographic competition, a bunch of like small things. I'd like recruit my friends and we'd make weird little films with radio control cars and stuff like that. And I loved doing that kind of thing. It was just, it was my hobby. It was the thing that I did on the side. And then I kept looking for ways to like tie my responsible day job that made me money to something that was just mildly more exciting than working at a bank.
Yeah. I mean, for a lot of people experience this, but going from learning, being in an education environment, to earning, obviously where you have an income and you're working for a company or building a company, it's a difficult transition. And the learning environment that most of us experience doesn't really prepare us well for what comes next.
There's definitely truth to that, yeah.
Yeah, even sort of the questions to ask or the chance to experience something before you jump in. And so it sounds like you got into it because of prestige and the fact that it got you to a city that was interesting to you. And then one thing led to the next, and now you're 4 years in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that the difference between learning and earning environments, because my wife, Laura, always makes fun of me for this, but I don't learn well in traditional environments. So like I used to skip a lot of class. Like I studied by myself and I'd figure things out, but I like project-based learning. Like I liked learning things in order to do something. And so versus theory, right?
Yeah.
And so throughout school, I was really more interested in what I could do with the things that I was learning versus learning them for learning's sake. And so I was, I'm very old, so this was part of like Web 1.0 in like 98, 99. And I found I could earn more doing freelance web dev and web design projects than the people that were graduating 2 years ahead of me. And so I started doing so much of that, I was really neglecting some of my schoolwork. And I eventually realigned and rebalanced and everything else. But it was one of those things where I was like, working is so much more interesting than studying.
Okay, because you like to get your hands in on the mix and be creative, obviously.
Yeah, like making things. Making things is my happy place, right? Like whatever it is, whether it's an animated film or building a software product or like building furniture, like making things is my happy place. It's like therapy for me.
But given your background of where you were being influenced by, I think, family members, but also culturally, and having a proper, responsible, admirable job, where did you go next after banking?
So I started looking for ways of how do I bridge this? How do I work in entertainment in some way, like where I can make some money? And so I was looking at MBA programs because everybody was telling me I had to go get an MBA. And so NYU, they had an MBA program which had a very strong entertainment, media, and technology track. And as it happened, was right next to one of the best film schools in the world. So like Tisch is literally next door. And so I was like, oh, this will be great. I will go get an MBA and then go work at HBO And while I'm there, I'm going to go and produce a bunch of shorts made by the next generation of great filmmakers coming out of Tisch. Like, this is the perfect marriage of
Ideal.
things.
Maybe it sounds like even you would like to have gone to Tisch, but like
Absolutely.
you are going to get your MBA.
Yeah, well, in fact, Tisch, there was a joint program which several of my good friends ended up doing, my good friends now did do, which is called the Producers Program, where you did a 3-year program, partially at Tisch and partially at Stern. I could not afford even the 2-year program that I did. And so a 3-year program plus the loss in wages and so on just didn't fit into my spreadsheet. And so I did the hack version of it, which is I went to Stern and then on the side I would produce films so I would like figure out logistics and like try really hard and make my creative input be heard and so on.
Yes,
for these
make
shorts.
good friends over there.
Exactly, which was very fun. And I was able to do a certain amount of that. The part of the plan that did not work out was going and working at HBO, because somewhere in my first year of my MBA, I found out how much you got paid at HBO starting out, and then compared that to my student loans, and the math did not math.
I love that you share that, because in all different industries, I have talked to people who have gotten themselves into graduate school programs, hoping that it sort of gives them the opportunity to combine something or to take that next step. And then only once they're in the program do they research, okay, now what is the reality of that job that I'm aiming for?
Right.
And often being extremely surprised and disappointed. But now you've already got the student loans coming in. And so your story is not something unusual, which is...
Yeah, I think it's fairly common.
Yeah. But anyway, so now you've got student loans increasing and creativity bubbling.
Yeah. And so at this point, I was like, okay, maybe I let these creative dreams take a back seat for the moment, because like from a financial perspective, this is, I have to pay back these loans, but I also need to financially, I need to set myself up in the future. And so I was like, well, investment banking, I definitely don't want to do, because I came from a bank and I know what that's like. And I definitely don't want to go back and do that. But consulting seems kind of interesting, because basically seems like you're just brains for hire. Like you go in and figure out a problem, a really open-ended problem, and I'm good at that. And so I interviewed for all of that. I did, however, I have made a habit of graduating into financial crises, both in 2002 and then in grad school. So if I ever go back to school for whatever reason, look out, world.
Yeah, watch out. We'll just get the timing right and just send a mass email.
Just let everybody know something's coming. But yeah, so it sucked. It was terrible.
Which is probably the world saying to you, like, we're not going to make this easy for you. Please go to the creative route.
Well, when you're writing a story or a film, as you get into the second act, there's a real danger of like stakes dropping, because the audience is familiar with everything that's happening. So you have to torture your protagonist. You have to like keep throwing things at them. And just when it seems they can take no more, you have to toss something else into the mix. And so,
well, that makes a lot of sense. What's happening on Netflix.
Yeah, exactly. So the formula continued. And so, I got off lucky, frankly. Like so many of my friends had people who had like multiple offers, like had offers rescinded. It was a bad time. And so...
And what happens, like to interject also, because I graduated from Harvard Business School in 2001, and the sort of .com boom at the time had crashed, and a lot of people do get offers, and then what they either say is that they postpone those offers and say you can come work in 9 months or a year, or they just flat out cancel the offer.
Right.
And so it's very difficult, especially when you've turned down other opportunities.
Exactly. Yeah. Plus student loans. And
yes.
And so
those don't go away.
Those don't just disappear. And so, yes, it was rough. And so I, especially as an international student, nobody in the US was hiring. Like it was fairly rough. And so I was like, how do I turn this disadvantage into an advantage? And it's like, my one thing is I'm not tied to the US. Like I don't have to work here. And so how do I wanted to move to the US, and like the MBA was supposed to be part of that. But I was like, all right, maybe I take the long way around instead, because for pure economic realities. And the two places that were hiring like crazy was the Middle East and Greater China. And I don't speak Mandarin. And so I applied to the Dubai office of BCG and ended up going there. And so BCG, for anybody that knows, is a big consulting firm, big strategy consulting firm. So most people have heard of McKinsey. BCG is number two, sort of McKinsey, BCG, and Bain. And so I went to BCG, or the Boston Consulting Group, and I worked in the Dubai office for a few years. And It was not filmmaking. It was certainly not the entertainment industry. Most of the work was public sector. There's some financial services type stuff. But the thing I did enjoy about it was, as distinct from the stories I'd heard about consulting in the US, when I've been doing recruiting, is instead of working on one small, tiny part of a business for like a business unit, you were working on the whole thing. It was just huge.
Because of your location?
Exactly.
Because of being in the Middle East?
Because
okay.
It was Dubai and it was 2008, 2009, and it was all, hey, we've got big ideas and big plans and a ton of money to make it happen. So like, get crazy. And that was actually very fun. So what we would work on things like the strategy for like an entire country in the GCC. Like, think big, 35 years. Over 35 years, how big does our airport need to be? Questions like that. How should we develop our social welfare policy? Like, how do we develop education plans for a country? It's things like that.
And just for context, how old are you at this point?
I was 30 years old. I was exactly 30.
Yeah. So 30, thinking of these massive, big questions that are landing in your lap.
And there were younger people than me on the teams. Like, I'd entered the consulting and the post-grad. So at that point, there were undergrad students there as well, which is kind of the thing that people make fun of consulting for in many ways, is like, oh, this 21-year-old is going to tell me how to run my business. And there's some truth to that, right? Like, it's often very young, very inexperienced people that are put on these teams. My usual response is, one, having a fresh pair of eyes is never a bad thing. Like, asking some silly questions, like, why is it done this way? Like, innovation tends to that tends to be where new ideas and new areas for growth come from. But also, some of these people are very, very smart, and they've got very experienced people guiding them.
Now, I have a question, because I talk to lots of people on campuses across the U.S. mostly, and a lot of them, the students come into the universities wanting to solve some big problem in the world, and the admissions team to get into university really want to know, what are your ambitions and how are you going to be a great human? And somewhere along the line, that aspiration is no longer fed, and the consulting firms and the banks and the big tech are on the other side ready to scoop up the students. And a lot of the students feel betrayed by that and will call people who go into consulting as sellouts.
Yeah.
And in my experience, having interviewed lots of people who have done amazing things in the world, often banking and consulting or big tech are wonderful stepping stones to create the magic that they later come in to do. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, like the pressure you felt, or maybe there was no pressure because it was a bad market and you took what you got and hoped for the best. But if you can talk a little bit about that sort of narrow funnel that's sort of pushing you into these jobs. And obviously it sounds like you got a pretty interesting experience, but...
Yeah, absolutely. I can completely understand that perspective. I will say, as an international student with no job prospects in 2009, I was very happy to land on a job and, my and a bank account and student loans and everything else I've talked about.
So call it what you will. I'm taking it.
If that means I'm a sellout, I'm a sellout. I will sell out 7 times before Sunday. Again, I think, like, similar to what I was saying about learning and earning environments, to me, again, this is an area where Laura, who you've spoken to before, my wife, and myself are quite different in that she was always on the dean's list. She went to every class and did everything else. Once I got a job offer, I spent my second year of business school making an insane 200-person musical video with all of my classmates that we played at the annual Follies. I think I did that almost full time. Right?
Wow.
Which is stupid, but also very fun.
You were captivated by something.
It was fun, and I had a path.
Yeah.
And it was very clear to me I was not going to get a job that competed with that, in any...
So this, in a way, was like the last meal before you went on a diet.
Yeah, kind of almost exactly that. I was like, this is my last chance to have some fun.
Your indulgence. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Before I go into the meat grinder. And there was definitely truth. Like, my first 2 years in consulting, like, there were interesting projects. There was also some terrible projects, like some absolutely awful ones, where I didn't know what I was doing. It was an industry that I wasn't interested in.
It's like a bit soul crushing.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, every day was torture, right? Like, it just sucked. Plus, the grind grind of consulting, which I think people don't talk about as much, which is...
So what is it? Tell us about the grind of consulting. What's the reality of being a consultant?
The thing of like working on big problems and working with very smart people and all of that is very true. For me, I think one of the things that I had difficulty adjusting to was just not living in one place or not having any kind of stability, because the week in Dubai is Sunday to Thursday versus Monday to Friday, right? Because Friday is like the big day off. And so on Sunday morning, you'd fly out to where I never did a single case that was local to Dubai. So I'd fly out to Bahrain or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or wherever. You'd fly out on Sunday morning, and then on Wednesday evening, you would come back and you'd spend one day in the office and you'd have the weekend at home. And then Sunday morning, you'd fly out again. So you spent very little time in one place. You basically live out of a box. And this is true in the vast majority of consulting work.
And tell us also, it's not like, oh, fun, you get to travel, because you're flying and then going to a box and sitting in an office probably like the majority of the day and then going home to your hotel to sleep.
Yeah. The worst version I've ever done of that was where I had a client that was a major European airline, and their office was in the airport. And so I literally would fly into this airport, live there for 4 days, and then fly back to New York. And that sucked. This was also not the most exciting city in Europe. So even if I left, but this is the other thing about the consulting grind is like you work pretty intense hours. And depending on the team you've got and the leadership on that team, sometimes it's more efficient and there's less wasted work. Sometimes there's a lot of wasted work and you're working really long hours for not good reasons.
Yeah. And you're a creative person, obviously. Could you bring any of that creativity to the table, or did you really just have to follow a system and a process and say, okay, this is to pay off my debt, but at some point I'll get to scratch that itch?
Totally. So yes and no. So the yes that I will say is that I always tended to have weird ideas, and I often found willing ears for those weird ideas. Because in consulting, you're kind of always trying to provide more than the expected answer, right? Like you're trying to provide a different perspective. And so frequently I would have unusual solutions, and I usually found pretty willing listening ears for that. And so there was that aspect. But there was also, this will sound silly, but I make really great, beautiful slides. And PowerPoint has like this horrible reputation in general. Everybody hates PowerPoint. But like a good deck tells a good story. Yeah. I literally do a guest lecture at NYU about how to tell, taking the lessons of film, TV, and books and applying them to how you tell business stories, because it's the same structure. There are very similar rules, and the visuals for how you communicate that story, whether it's infographic type stuff or a mix of words and visuals and things like all that kind of stuff, does have like the design aspect of that type of business story does actually have a material impact on its effectiveness.
Well, I'm so curious also to get your input on, as AI is taking over a lot of the intellect of jobs, and they obviously, us against a computer, there's just no way we can compete. But humans do have this I think creativity and curiosity and compassion are sort of what can differentiate us. And I'm wondering also if you have advice for young people to lean into their odd, unique, interesting aspects and follow those, even if it's alongside a career path that can pay, to be differentiated.
Yeah, I have consistently found that the things that I thought were weaknesses or weird about me could be applied in ways that made them strengths or differentiators. And usually that came from a shift in perspective, right? It would be like, well, I can't do that way. And that's kind of what everybody else does. And if I try to compete like that, I'm going to lose, no question about it. But if I change the game, if I make the game something else and force them to compete or like on my dimension.
Change the story.
Change the narrative. Then not only do I have an advantage, but I'm so far ahead of everybody else that like there's a clear winner. And so, and often like that's easier said than done. Like that can sound a little trite. Often it's several years of grinding and not being able to make that happen. And then suddenly an opportunity comes along where you are able to do that. I can give you an example of that. So I was in Dubai for several years. About a year and a half in, I will say I did not enjoy living in Dubai for several reasons. A big part of which was I didn't feel like, even outside of work, I didn't feel like my creative side was nourished very much. And part of that is because the vast majority of people that look like outsiders that come to live in Dubai are driven primarily by a profit motive. Like the whole setup it's set up like that, right? I'm sure things are different and have evolved now, but I'm talking about when I was there. And that was definitely true of the vast majority of my colleagues. I will say there were exceptions because at one point, I think after I'd been there for 3 years, I got, I think, about 20 of my colleagues to participate in the 48-hour film festival. Have you heard of this?
Okay.
This is like literally you get a set of prompts at the beginning of a weekend, and then you have to write, shoot, edit, score an original short film in 48 hours. We ended up coming second in Dubai, which for a group of not filmmakers, like none of these people had ever made a film before, was quite something. I attribute it in large part to the work ethic that was there. Because with consultants, you're like, well, of course we're not sleeping the weekend.
And they want to win. Yes,
and everybody wanted to win. Exactly. So there were exceptions, but I decided fairly quickly, I was like, I don't want to be here very much longer. And like I said, I wanted to move to the US. And so I applied to the LA office of BCG for a transfer, because LA was where, we did
more media
and entertainment work and so on. And the administrative head of that office, who is now a close friend, rejected me 3 times. And I've given her so much crap about it since. But initially, I remember being told that I was like a high volatility candidate, like because I'd had some very good ratings and some not so good ratings and so on.
Sounds like if you're interested, you're all in. And if you're not interested, it's a grind.
Exactly.
So let's get to animated film. So how did you get the switch?
So there was still a little bit, there's like 8 years during which I moved to the LA office. And then right around that time was when there were these discussions of starting a new part of the consulting business, which ended up being digital ventures. And that was like almost a version of consulting that was tailor-made for my particular skill set, because it was disrupt by default. It was like, how do you help a big Fortune 100 company build the disruptive business that's going to eat its lunch at some point in the future? So it's like, how do you look at the business in a different way? What is the 3-person in a garage startup that's going to completely disrupt this business, right? And so this was like, innovation consulting is not something new anymore, but like in 2013, it was like nothing else existed like that. And so we hired the first engineers, designers, everything else.
So that got you back to LA?
So I had just moved to, they said yes, and I'd moved to LA. And that was when they started talking about setting up this business. And so I ended up being employee 0 of this new business. And there were a whole bunch of other folks like that. I mean, I was a small part of the founding team of this group, but we ended up growing to over 1,000 people over the course of the next few years. We grew way too fast. We made every mistake possible along the way, but it ended up being the fastest growing new business in BCG's history. We ended up launching over 200 companies over the course of several years. It was a very, very, very successful business. It's now part of what's called BCGX, which is BCG's kind of innovation and build element. But so I did that for 8 years. And I made partner in 2017. I would not have made partner in the traditional business. I was just too weird to do that. But this business, I was the right kind of weird. And it ended up being creative enough that I felt partially fed, but also very much a kind of exciting new growth business. And so, very monetarily lucrative as well for the company. And so I did that for a while. And then by 2020, I had been doing what I used to call basically 2 jobs. From 2014, when we launched DV, to 2020, for those 6 years, I'd more or less been doing 2 jobs, which is all the work itself, like the consulting services and serving clients, but also building this new business and figuring out what does our career development look like? Because it can't look like regular BCG. How do we hire? Because the people we need are different from regular, so there was this whole, it was literally 2 jobs, and I was really burned out. And so I took a year off in 2020. I took a sabbatical in 2020, which, is one of those wonderful things that consulting firms let you do every now and then, because it is a kind of almost gig-based kind of thing. You can go away project to project. Anyway, so I went away for a year and I experimented with like what I might want to do next. So again, in my most risk averse possible way, I had a whole bunch of different projects. The only rule was that none of them could have a business plan attached to them. And so I tried out a whole bunch of different things. I like built some software. I animated in a game engine for the first time and so on. I built some furniture. And it was mostly because I figured that like the day-to-day of doing something that I have idealized in my head might be very different from,
You wanted some experience,
Yeah.
hands-on, so you're not glamorizing the other side.
Exactly. I wanted to prototype it. And so the thing that just really lit my hair on fire was being able to animate in real time, which is different from I'm not going to get too technical, but like traditional animation pipelines, there's a lot of 3D animation pipelines. There's a lot of like you do the thing and then you hit render and then you wait 48 hours and then you see the thing that came out. And then if the character's eyeballs point the wrong direction, you have to hit it again and like do the whole thing again. And it just, especially to learn as an indie solo animator, it doesn't work. Like the feedback cycle is not fast enough. But what's happened in the last few years is game engines like Unreal and Unity, which are used for AAA visuals, like high-end games, have built a lot of filmmaking tools into themselves. So you have like virtual cameras and things like that. And so you can really kind of operate a virtual film set as a single person on your desktop at home, which is unthinkable just a few years ago. And so doing that for the first time on my sabbatical, it felt like having superpowers. It was unbelievable. And it just absolutely lit my head on fire with the possibilities of like all the things that I could do now. And so I tried to not go back. They wouldn't let me not go back at the end of that year. And so I went back for a year and a half, wrapped everything up. And then in 2022, April, I quit to make animated films full time. There was no business plan. There was no real way of plan for how to make money doing this. It was just something I knew I would love doing every day. And it was something it was like the long deferred dream being given life again.
Yeah. And it sounds like that it was just building up in you all this time and like was no longer possible to contain now that you have found this outlet that actually was where you were creating magic.
Yeah. I describe it as the hobby that wouldn't die. And it was something that was just not possible to do nights and weekends. I had tried doing it, but I had a pretty senior job and there's not a lot of free time. And consulting in general is intense hours. I just didn't have the time to do it. And as an indie solo animator, I'm literally trying to do 20 to 30 different people's jobs. Like in a conventional studio, you'd have a bunch of different people doing each of these jobs. That's why it takes 400 to 600 people to make a studio animated feature. And doing it all by yourself, I'm not good at any of them, but I'm doing kind of crap versions of each of them and putting them all together. It's not the kind of thing you can do part-time.
Yeah, yeah. And when you and I had talked, you had mentioned there is an impact layer on the work that you're doing in animation. Are you able to share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think that kind of happens almost organically. Like I can't stop it from happening necessarily, simply because for me, the stories that I find interesting and the stories that I find myself writing tend to come from my own experience as I'm an immigrant. I'm always confused by the terminology of whether I'm a first generation immigrant or just an immigrant. Or I moved. I moved as an adult.
Yeah.
But as an immigrant, I tend to tell stories from an immigrant perspective. But I love robots and vampires and fantasy and sci-fi, and so the settings tend to be more genre type settings and stories like that. But the themes tend to be outsiders looking in. It tends to be questioning the way things are. It tends to often come from the perspective of like the minority looking at the majority and being like, hey, we're people too. And so if you believe in the idea of like films and television and so on as being an empathy machine, like that's not my term. Much smarter people than me came up with that. But it is truly, stories are an empathy machine. Like it is the way in which you develop empathy for a protagonist, regardless of their background or history or other trappings, because you know their history, you know their culture. And that echoes my experience living around the world. Like it is impossible to like make a blanket judgment about a group of people once you have eaten their food and played with their children and visited their houses and so on. Like it is impossible to treat a group of people as them because, the vast majority of people just kind of want to live a good life and want a good life for their children. And things like that. And so it's conveying the complexity and nuance of lots of different kinds of people living together. That tends to drive most of my stories. They often have robots and vampires in them, but
That's so fun. And what about where you are now makes it all worth it?
I think the short answer to that is that I wake up excited to work every day. And it's been 3 years now since I quit. And I was wondering whether that would fade over time, and it hasn't. Like, I can vouch for the fact that it hasn't. I still wake up very excited about what I'm going to do that day. I have other anxieties because I'm just me, like in terms of I have what I call shipping anxiety because I tend to take longer than I plan. I'm always very optimistic when I'm planning. And this is a new thing for me, like learning how to do these things. So I'm not good at predicting how long.
You're used to being in a big organization with lots of members on the team, and now you're sample size one.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I'm not good at it yet, right? And like I'm still learning, and so there's a learning curve. And what happens, especially in an artistic field, is that your taste improves so much faster than your ability to create at that level. And so my standards rise much higher than my ability to like meet them. And so for one of the films that I'm making, like I've restarted it 3 times because I'm like, oh, this is what I'm doing right now is not good enough. And I tend to bite off more than I can chew. I like doing that. It has typically led me to good places, but it's slow. I don't have the quick dopamine hit of like, delivered this, done, finished, move on,
I also would just love to touch on, before we wrap up, you and I had talked before, and the income piece is still to be determined on this aspect of your career.
Yeah.
And how do you balance that, or what allows you to balance that and give you time on this decision?
Yeah. So a big part of that is what I spent the last 20 years doing, which is, my much more conventional, my sellout career.
Yeah. Gave you a cushion.
Yeah. It's given me a significant runway. The second part to that is like burn rate, right? So like the typical trap of a sellout career is upgrading your lifestyle in proportion to your income. And I give my wife a lot of credit for this in terms of like being like, do we really need that? And almost always the answer is no. And so we've kind of kept our burn rate relatively low, like very low compared to like what I was earning. And that is a big part of why I'm able to do this.
It's giving you the freedom not to stay on a ladder that is not your ladder.
Exactly. Yeah. The last part that I will say is having a partner that is not just supportive of this kind of thing, but encouraging me to do these kinds of things. Because if Laura hadn't pushed me to like quit and pursue this, because she knows me better than anyone else in the world. She knows what like sets my hair on fire. And so without that, I don't know if I would have been able to do this. I don't know if I would feel comfortable doing what I'm doing without that kind of like support. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially growing up, how you had mentioned, where you have these idealized career paths that you're supposed to take. Okay. So last question is, for somebody starting out, knowing they have a creative itch, desire, but also needing some prestige, some contacts, some income, what would you have done differently in your path if you could do it again? Obviously, it's never a perfect answer because you've now got different information, but is there anything you would have changed?
So I'll speak generally first, and then I'll speak for me specifically. So generally, I think having a clear-eyed picture of your economic reality as a grounding basis is so much more, like it's so important compared to the amount of time I feel like educational institutions spend teaching you about it, like in high school, understanding basic economics and like, what do you need to live? How does money work? Like that kinds of stuff, I think is getting a really clear grounding of that. And then if what you realize is that, hey, my parents want me to pursue my dreams and they're actually going to give me some money so that I can figure some stuff out, use that. Don't be ashamed of it. Like, don't shy away from it. That is such an enormous privilege that some people have. You should go after it. But if you don't, then be really clear-eyed about like, hey, I got to make some money to live. How do I do that? And for how long do I do that? Right? Because when you're young, I feel like there's my school time and then there's my career. And people tend to think about careers as one thing, right? But in a conventional working career of like 50 to 60 years, I spent 10 years in consulting, 12 years in consulting. Like, I am considered a expert in that particular area, like well past an expert. After 5 or 6 years in that area, I was like considered an expert. You can easily have 5 or 6 radically different careers if you want. You can have them build on top of each other, but you can also have like 5 or 6 radically different careers over a conventional working life. And most of the more interesting people I know have had really different careers. They've done a bunch of really different things, and they tend to be more interesting, better adjusted, smarter, happier for it. And so I think that's kind of the broad answer.
It's okay to take the scenic route.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot more fun frequently.
Yeah. Well, I've loved having you, and I've noticed how often you are laughing, and it just seems like you've really found a place that makes you happy. I don't know how you were in Dubai, but you seem very happy how you are living now. So it was a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for sharing more about your story.
Likewise, Georgia. This was a lot of fun. This kind of thing works a little bit like therapy, but yes, as you've pointed out, I do tend to be a generally happy person. I am a lot happier now.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks so much, Georgie. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Okay, it's time for a couple hot takes on this episode. Anthony shared something powerful. He said, "I have consistently found that the things that I thought were weaknesses or weird about me could be applied in ways that made them strengths or differentiators. Instead of trying to compete on everybody else's terms, he learned to change the game and force others to compete on his dimension. His consulting background now informs his immigrant perspective storytelling. His engineering mind helps him build tools for animators. The question isn't whether you should suppress your weird interest. It's how you can use them to create something only you can make." And as you can hear, Anthony is a true creative. And he thinks it's likely that he will have a handful of careers during his 90,000 hours. He mentioned you can have 5 or 6 radically different careers if you want. His advice? Get a clear-eyed picture of your economic reality, then be strategic about your sequencing. He spent 12 years in consulting not as a detour, but as one chapter that funded and informed the next. The most interesting people he knows have had really different careers, and they're, in his words, more interesting, better adjusted, smarter, and happier for it. And that's a wrap for today's episode of Work That's Worth It. Remember, every conversation we share is designed to empower you to build a career that's truly worth your time and energy. There are future disruptors out there just like you who would appreciate the conversations in this podcast. Please support me by spreading the word and sharing this episode with a friend or two, or visit my website at georgieenthoven.com. That's spelled GeorgieEnthoven.com. Until next time, ask yourself, what problems am I solving, and are they worth my valuable time? Your intentional choices today can lead to exponential impact tomorrow. Thanks for listening.